This week on the agenda, as the 25th China-EU summit concludes in Beijing, just where do relations stand between the world's second and third largest economies? This week, President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, were in Beijing to talk trade with both China's President Xi and Premier Li Qiang. After they met, President Xi called on EU officials to properly handle differences and frictions when it comes to trade, saying Europe's current challenges do not come from China. So where does that leave relations between the two? Here with me to consider just that are Karl Falkenberg, Senior Advisor at Shearwater Global and former Deputy Director General for Trade at the European Commission; Xiankun Lu, former Senior Chinese Trade Diplomat and now Managing Director of LEDECO Geneva; and Bernardo Mendia, Secretary General at the Portugal-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Gentlemen, thanks for coming on the agenda. Karl, let's start with you, because the lead up to this week's summit was pretty tense. What do you think happened over the course of the gathering that might change that?
Well, the times are difficult, and so it's not a surprise that it was going to be a difficult summit. I think when leaders have the time, have the occasion to exchange directly, that is a positive in itself. But one shouldn't expect that that suddenly all the problems are under control or have disappeared. We see a serious dismantling of the world trading regime, not originating in China, but rather in the United States. But there are consequences, there are concerns about how we individually react to a US market being closed off by tariffs. More difficult to access theirs, therefore the risk of deviation of trade flows. And the Europeans are particularly concerned about what China's large industrial capability will produce in terms of additional pressure on the European market. We have a security situation that is more unstable since Russia's aggression on Ukraine. And between the European Union and China, that will continue to be a difficult issue also.
Lu, let me bring you in. I wonder if you agree with what Karl had to say, because President Xi urged officials to properly handle differences and frictions. What do you think he meant by that?
I agree 100% with what Karl just said, but maybe just to add one point that what happens before the summit that helps is that I think that leaders of both see the need to take this opportunity, the 50 years anniversary of diplomatic relations, to overcome their differences or to deal with the differences and frictions, not immediate for solution, but a step forward. And also to reposition this relationship in a positive framework, which probably was not the case before the summit, and to engage at the highest political level. And I think China and the EU are trading daily 200 million euros or 15 billion renminbi. And it will be politically suicidal to imagine putting such an important relationship in a negative framework with confrontation or friction. On the frictions and differences, I think that with that kind of political will and engagement, negotiations on those differences and frictions have also witnessed some positive signals. And which, of course, is what President Xi meant by properly handling them, simply because if not properly handled, such difference of frictions will definitely undermine the political will and any progress ahead. So we have seen some positive signals on EVs, on rare earths. This, of course, does not mean that they will simply neglect their differences, including the systemic one, but both are committed to seek dialogue and for concrete solutions. I think that's the way forward.
Bernardo, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was quite forthright in the news conference following the summit. She said the talks were excellent, but that the EU and China had reached an inflection point and that trade needed to become more balanced. How do you see that happening?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I don't see, of course, I understand the narrative, the inflection point that it is necessary. However, that has not happened yet. Maybe in the narrative it's starting, but for the time being, what we see is that China continues to be more competitive in almost everything they do. And so we also need that, actually, because we need to keep our inflation down and we need to keep providing goods to the European families at a good price so that they have a good quality of life. And I also think, on a last note, I also think that we should and can focus on what we can do, which is very much, I'm now talking very much with my active Secretary General of the Portugal-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and that would be to deregulate more, to help our companies to be more competitive, to help universities. I think there are many things we can do which depend of us only, and we must do them at the same time that we try to persuade every commercial partner to do what's best in the long term, even if they need to abdicate of something in the short term.
So conversations about free trade need to happen alongside conversations around regulation, around education, about all of those people-to-people connections. Karl, where do you think that the trade balance is headed? I mean, President Xi said the current challenges facing Europe do not come from China.
I think in a way, the present difficulties are created by Donald Trump's tariff line, basically completely upsetting whatever has been negotiated in the last 50 years in terms of international trade rules, creation of a World Trade Organization that has created predictability, certainty for companies to engage in international trade, has been tremendously successful, has been particularly successful also in lifting millions of Chinese out of poverty since China in the beginning of the century acceded to the World Trade Organization. But we do have issues with the way in which China is engaging and continues to engage in international trade, and it has become a major actor, and it is a concern not only for the United States, it's a concern here in Europe, and we do have the impression that on many counts trade is not really entirely run according to world trade rules. So we have tried to argue cases to engage in dialogue with China on the basis of world trade rules. The problem now is that our other big partner on the other side of the Atlantic is completely disregarding those rules. And so we are now facing a situation where we have to, in one way or another, find other relations with each other because major partners are not really playing by WTO rules. And that will remain a challenge. And I don't see any short-term solutions to this. Basically, I think we will see that we all have to focus a little bit more on our internal market rather than just trying to grow with exports on international markets. That goes for the European Union and its single market, which remains for the moment the largest market available on the planet. But it also will be true for China. China will need to work more on creating growth on its own market for the capacity, the industrial capacity they have built up, if it's not to disrupt international relations further.
Lu, one of the key three things that Xi Jinping emphasized during the meeting with the European Union leaders was multilateralism and fairer global governance. I wonder what you take that to mean, and is it perhaps sending a message to Donald Trump, especially as China and the United States they're preparing for those trade talks taking place in Stockholm next week?
I think it's a very important point, as Karl just said, that when we are seeing major players like the US deviating from multilateralism and WTO rules, and also not only the US, but some other countries are surrendering to the US pressure to do the same. So this is the US and Trump tariff is a global challenge that no one can escape. So all other countries must work together to respond to that challenge. So that, I think, where the multilateralism and global governance chips in. Particularly worth noting for China and the EU, and at least what I hear in Geneva with all the WTO members here, that there's a strong appeal for the two to take a leadership role in responding to the Trump challenge. There's also a strong view that China and the EU, in their bilateral negotiations with the US, like the coming Stockholm one between China and the US, must not violate their WTO commitments and obligations. And then many also say that they should work together with other willing countries to advance WTO reform, to make it better. And China and the EU have worked well, cooperating to do many things on that aspect. One example would be the so-called MPI, the interim appeal mechanism on disputes when the WTO appellate body was paralyzed under Trump 1.0. So I think both could do many things within the multilateral framework. Thank you.
And Bernardo, what do you think from that European perspective? Can you see China and the EU working more closely together to form maybe something of a united front against the United States?
Working together for sure, against someone, namely the US, no. We of course, every country will have to fight for its own interests, just like you've mentioned that President Xi Jinping made his statements. He made it to defend his interests, which is normal, and every country should do the same. Sometimes we will unite with one side, sometimes we will unite with another side, but the main point is that we are always defending our own interest, and it needs to be a reasonable interest so that we can defend it. Otherwise, it's not even sustainable in the long run, because it will create antagonic feelings, which will end up turning against us. So in terms of working together with China and the US, by the way, definitely yes. We need to work together because we still have many challenges ahead of us, which need to be addressed. It was mentioned, the pollution, but we also have to mention poverty and hunger. We still have 700 to 800 people that have hunger. So this is terrible. And if we don't work together, if our supply chains are not interconnected, if our leaders, as you've mentioned before, don't have a very close contact, they must have each other's phones and they must talk with each other, because the problems need to be solved and we need to advance to create better conditions to everyone, which in the end, it's the main function of leaders. And so that's what we expect. So yes, I'm very optimistic that there is room for working together with everyone.
Karl, I want to focus now on the green transition and the joint statement between China and the EU on climate change. The first China-EU joint statement for 6 years. What message do you think that sends the rest of the world?
I think that's one of the positives China has become the largest emitter of CO2 and therefore is a major player on trying to handle climate change. China has taken major investments in clean energy, but on the other hand, China continues to invest in coal-based energy, and so while it's good that the two sides are sending a common signal recognizing climate change as a key issue and declaring that they will work together to reduce emissions, to work towards a climate neutrality in the years to come, even if the timelines are different. I think the fact that here two major actors are working together is positive, is definitely positive. But we need to also make sure that we see real action rather than just political statements, even if they come from the top people. So I think beyond the statement itself, which is positive, I would hope that we would see coordinated action to really face the enormous challenge of climate change. Change is happening every day. It is accelerating. Time is running away from everyone on this planet to keep it a livable place for humans. So it's an essential point, and we really need to move towards decisive action to control this man-made climate change. Good that China and EU are looking at it in the same way. Problem that the United States have a president that is fundamentally denying all of this.
Lu, let's talk a little bit more then about real action rather than just talking about projects for years to come, because that statement did highlight many areas of cooperation, areas like methane, carbon markets and green technologies. I wonder where you see room for progress in those areas between China and the EU in the near term.
I think I agree very much with what Karl just said, that both China and the EU are leading on climate change and also green transition. And this is the very aspect on which they can work together. So it is really music to ears to see this bilateral statement issued on climate change. And this is very much to the surprise of many of those who said that before the summit that this could not happen. I mean, coming back to which areas, if you compare the EU's Green Deal in 2019 and also its Net Zero Industry Act in 2023, and China's white paper on green development in the new era, also in 2023, you would see many overlapping areas which could potentially be room for good progress in bilateral cooperation. This could include energy, green technologies such as solar, wind, EVs, and many other things. Other than the areas, I think probably one thing for concrete reaction is that probably China EU should establish a kind of working group or bilateral mechanism to tackle on those issues, because not only for cooperation, there are also some areas where they have frictions, so as to put everything together and to work together through that work group. That probably will be a good basis for further concrete actions to come. Thank you.
Bernardo, with you, agree with that? Because after all, sustainability is going to be built into every future trade agreement, isn't it? I wonder where you see China and the EU working together.
Mm-hmm. Well, not necessarily in every trade agreement. There are some that might not make sense depending on the topic. But of course that I agree with everything that was said by both Lu and Karl, and I believe strongly that the best way of achieving results, particularly achieving more efficiency is to let companies work more freely. So, of course, free trade market and as many economic exchanges as possible, that will bring wealth and that will bring more and better conditions of life to the people in the end.
Karl, after the summit, European Council President Antonio Costa also said the EU and China wanted to work together on global peace and security. What's your view on that, and how do you see it happening?
It will have to happen, but it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a challenge. I mean, we obviously have a situation where the Europeans are extremely concerned about what's happening in Ukraine. And there are many questions about how the China-Russia relationship evolves and whether China can have a peace-oriented or directed influence on Russia. I think that's going to be one key security concern that will continue to have to be debated, discussed between the two sides. But let me come back also to raw materials and competition for raw materials. I think strategically, the Europeans have repeatedly made rather uncomfortable experience with China's handling of exports of key raw materials, and Europe has developed its own strategy for securing access to these essential raw materials, and we will definitely try to become less dependent in international relations. When you have one partner dominating the supply of a material, a critical raw material, then you are facing potential risks. And I think Europe is well advised to, with all the necessary trust that needs to be built between China and Europe for accessibility to these raw materials, Europe will seek a second leg where it develops its own access to these in order to have a more balanced situation. But these are issues that will continue to be with us for the next 10, 15, 20 years at least.
Bernardo, where do you think this week leaves us in terms of the relationship between the world's second and third biggest economies?
I think Karl was very realistic just now in terms of what we're facing for the future. It will be challenging, but I also think that we should be a little bit even naive in the sense we have to give a chance to the other side to show also its goodwill. And we do have World Trade Organization, we do have rules, so we have to give a chance to the international rules to work. And for that, we have to believe that every side will fulfill with its obligations. So I hope, and I think it's possible, that everything is negotiable and that we can get to good agreements, again, in the benefit, always in the benefit of the people, because the more stability that we have, the better it will be for all of us.
Lou, what would you like to see happening to ensure that, you know, as President Xi put it, China and the EU keep their bilateral relationship growing in the right direction and work together to usher it into an even brighter next 50 years?
Thank you. Very quickly, of course, the next 50 years of EU-China relationship is a long way to go. And I think that the first thing is that they must work together to keep it on a positive framework and keep it in the right direction. This must be designed through China-EU perspective in their own interests and independently from any other third countries. As said by some media, if one sees it now as a bilateral rapprochement because of a third country president, very soon I think you may see a bilateral estrangement when the third country changes its president. Secondly, I think EU and China must work together both at the political level and to rebuild trust. As Karl just said, that there were a lot of things in Russia and US in between, which creates the lack of trust. And so as to overcome this kind of trust deficit and try to move ahead with a better political basis. I think the last thing, the thirdly, is that they must start to explore the possibility to establish a long-term legal instrument for its bilateral relations. If I can take trade, for example, China-EU still ongoing. The China-EU Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement was signed in 1985, exactly 40 years ago when I was still in junior high school, and is not updated up to now. Hence, it's impossible to see how you can govern bilateral trade and investment cooperation in the 21st century with that kind of outdated agreement. If I could say so, it is like trying to shoot a drone with arquebus. So it's not going to work. They have to start looking at an updated new bilateral framework to govern 50 years to come.
Just quickly, Karl, I wonder if you agree, and where do you see China-EU relations headed in the near and the more distant future?
Well, I would slightly argue against what Lu was just saying, because when I look at international trade relations, Europe does not really have a bilateral overall agreement with the United States, our largest trading partner for many centuries. And we don't have one with China, but we have tried to set up a World Trade Organization under which we were all committed to conduct our trade relationship. So I'm not sure that updating or heading headlong into more bilateralism is actually a solution to the problems that we have been talking about. The challenges are global challenges, and I think these challenges need to find multilateral answers wherever possible. And so I think we should focus more on playing by World Trade Organization rules, updating, perhaps modernizing them here or there, but they need to be applied not only between the two, China and EU, they need to be applied globally. The same is true for climate change. We need climate change action coming from the Europeans and from the Chinese, but from all other actors on the planet.
Karl Falkenberg, Xiankun Lu and Bernardo Mendia, thank you all very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, we'll delve into trade relations between China and the US as the two sides meet in Stockholm. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.